although I said up until the end of the Red Scare. I think that's what I'm going to. Hello. I can tell there is a buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation, excitement for the coming delicacy next week that we know as the midterm. I want to talk about that just very briefly, that the midterm will cover everything up to Chapter 5 in Patterson, and it will cover everything up and including the end of the Red Scare today. The format, as we talked about the first day of class, will be all objective. You need not bring anything but a pencil and a pen. No blue books are required. It will be a series of questions that will be multiple choice, some fill in the blank, perhaps some matching, some true and false, and perhaps even some cause and effect relationship questions. But you still won't need anything but a pencil and a pen. You'll have choices. A cause and effect simply means that everything that we've talked about has a cause. And every cause has an effect or a multiple effect. So there may be a few of those. But there will be a variety, a cornucopia of different types of questions for, I like to call it the delicacy next week. And for those in viewing land, with all your emails, we will meet, we will gather together in Auditorium 2. So that has been the big $64,000 question. Auditorium 2 for the viewing audience. You will be with me, same time, same channel, next week. Well, I think I like to be very candid about how I developed the exam. The jungle, there will be questions in the jungle, but obviously because it is a novel, it will be the most general type of question. I mean, you need to know who Jurgis is. If you don't know who he is, or who wrote the jungle, or that the jungle led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, then you might be in trouble. But that is the sort of question about the jungle that I will ask. They will be, because it is a novel, the questions have to be by nature general. The textbook, I think, is important only to corroborate, to support what I have said in class and the words that I have put on the screen. Clearly, more than 90% of the exam will come from what we have talked about in class. That should take care of next week. So let us go on and talk about the Red Scare. But before I talk about the Red Scare, it's interesting. In 1920, this is sort of a tidbit I want to throw in here. In 1906, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1920, Woodrow Wilson will be the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in creating the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Now, of course, you know what the irony is about that. And the irony is that, indeed, that was Woodrow Wilson's brainchild. The League of Nations, and essentially even the outlines for the Treaty of Versailles ends the war. And yet we know that the U.S. does not sign the treaty because of partisan politics and Wilson's own stubbornness, his refusal to compromise with the Republicans, which will doom the Senate's passage of the Treaty of Versailles. And we never joined the League of Nations, Wilson's brainchild, which again, I love that term that Thomas Bailey, the historian, summarizes Wilson's failure to get the League included or passed by the U.S. Senate as the supreme act of infanticide. Ooh, it just has a certain ring to it, yes.
Who was that said that?
Thomas Bailey, who's an historian, a diplomatic historian, calls it the supreme act of infanticide. And indeed it was. I mean, Wilson was an extraordinarily strong-willed person. We talked about that at the beginning. On the one hand, that indeed can be a strength for a president as it was for Roosevelt. But if you take it too far, it can hurt you as it did Woodrow Wilson and this country. Wilson, in an attempt to avoid compromise, will return to America, and he will begin to take a trip around the country in September. And in September, Wilson will suffer a stroke. But even partially incapacitated, Wilson will not yield. This was an extraordinarily stubborn man. He still will not yield, and he will still not allow his party to vote for the treaty and the League of Nations. For the rest of his term after his stroke, some have argued that, in fact, his wife will act as a sort of surrogate president. She will screen the people who will have access to the president until the 1920 election. But even partially incapacitated, Wilson had even given some indication. This is how strong this. Wilson was always a small, fragile man, but only fragile in stature, but not certainly in heart or in constitution. He even gave the impression that he was going to run again in 1920, but he doesn't. But he suffers a stroke, but he is rewarded, as I indicated a moment ago. You have two presidents now, interestingly enough, within a short period of time, who will win the Nobel Peace Prize in America. I think that is interesting. But what about this war? And what about the bickering between the Democratic and the Republican Party? To be sure, the American people were they were bewildered. One, that the war ended so suddenly. We talked about how much energy it took to get the Americans warmed up to the occasion, since Wilson had run on a peace platform in the November 1916 election. In fact, he won on a platform, he kept us out of war. Most Americans were grateful for that. And yet, in April of 1917, suddenly things had changed so dramatically that America, as I indicated in great bold headlines in the New York Times, America now in Armageddon. They were now throwing their doughboys into that carnage, into that inferno in Europe that Woodrow Wilson hesitated to do earlier. But once Wilson began to explain the reason that America was in the war, once he emotionally described the war as a war to make the world safe for democracy. I mean, that is a wonderful and powerful rhetorical phrase. Few people would be untouched by that phrase. Whether it was true or not, it still was an incredibly powerful phrase. And as he characterized the war as a holy war, this wasn't just a war. It was a holy war, a war in which you would have peace without victory, a war between good and evil. People love wars that are between good and evil. There's no gray lines. There's no gray in between. You don't have to worry about complications. It's simple. It's good versus evil. It's dark versus light. It's, as one person put it, it was a war to return the tomb of Christ to where it belongs. That had been somehow, the tomb had been disturbed by the ghoulish, insidious Huns, as the Germans were affectionately called once the war started. So the Americans are ready to fight. Once this country fully mobilized, both emotionally and physically in terms of churning out war material, it was a thing of beauty. America had an enormous capacity, as it would in both wars. Its greatest strength was, again, its natural resources and its economy. It was able, once it converted from a peacetime to a wartime economy, it was second to no country in the world in what it could throw at its enemies. So America was ready with all the advertisements to arouse patriotism and loyalty, even at the expense often of people's civil rights. People got behind the war effort. But it just as suddenly as the Americans were now ready to just rip the Central Powers apart, to do what Clemenceau had said in the peace treaty, to make sure that the Germans never rose again. Just as the Americans were ready to undertake that task fully, what happened? The war ended suddenly on an armistice. The worst possible way that you could end an armed conflict is with an armistice. It is indecisive, and it allows interpretations of what had happened to always be offered, as we saw with Hitler. So just as the Americans were bewildered how we got into the war, in 1918 and going into 1919, they were just as bewildered as to why the war ended so soon, without a clear-cut victory, without making the world safe for democracy. Because what would happen, as I indicated, that once the Republicans made it very clear to the European countries, England and France, that Wilson did not speak with one voice. When he returned after the first preliminary draft of the treaty, they shredded the treaty and they went back to business as usual. Forget about the 14 points. Forget about secret treaties. Forget about peace without victory. Forget about armaments and punitive measures. They all became features of the post-war treaty. And the Americans felt somehow incomplete. They somehow felt cheated. One historian who has written a number of things on what is called psycho history argues about the Red Scare. He looks at it from a psychological perspective. He said that when people experience trauma in their lives, when their lives become disordered and there's no order, that the one way that people often seek to create internal order in their lives is to seek some sort of order in their external lives. What he really meant was you seek something to explain why you feel the way that you feel, so you feel better, and you look for a scapegoat. In 1919, we have the fruits of this disillusionment, this bewilderment, in a phenomenon known as the Red Scare of 1919. There are two general points that I can make about the Red Scare of 1919. One, the Red Scare was this fear that once the Russians made it clear that they were not going to establish a democratic government in Russia, but what they were going to establish was a communist government in Russia, a totalitarian government in Russia. That many Americans were told that the Russians had announced that they were now going to embark upon a worldwide revolution to convert every country to communism. The word Bolshevism became, by the middle of 1919, a common term in America. The Bolsheviks are coming. After the collapse of several governments in Europe that became communist, it was clear to some in America that the Bolsheviks were now targeting America. So the Red Scare of 1919 was this fear that the Bolsheviks were going to take over America. Early, there were rumors that the Bolsheviks were sending large sums of money clandestinely to America to finance the fledgling American Communist Party that had just been established in 1919. Established by a real hard anarchist. I'm being facetious. It was established by a cheerleader, a Harvard cheerleader by the name of Reed, John Reed. It really wasn't Reed, R-E-E-D. Reed was anything but I'm being facetious, but a Harvard cheerleader. He was the first head of the American Communist Party in America. Actually, a movie was made about him, Reds, not too long ago with Warren Beatty. Well, it's been a while now, not too long ago. This fear of the Bolsheviks somehow undermining American democratic institutions was extended to include somehow the fear of all foreigners that came into America, particularly foreigners from Southern and Eastern European countries in the post-World War I period. This fear of foreigners is called xenophobia. America went through a period of xenophobia, or fear of foreigners. And it was not just confined to Bolsheviks or Russians. Anyone, it seemed, who was different for a while, particularly from Southern and Eastern European countries, was subject, was suspicious. Well, the Red Scare, the background to it, as I've indicated, was first this feeling of needing to find out what had went wrong. Why was there no decisive victory? Why did Americans feel cheated? Into this void came these accusations. Only a few people at first took these accusations seriously. There were some people who began to argue that as the year continued during 1919, that a series of strikes in America by labor was proof that this was the first step to a Bolshevik or a communist takeover. That these strikes, in fact, had been organized and had been supported, and the communists and the Bolsheviks were behind the strikes of 1919, when that's not true. What happens in 1919 is that when the war ends, the agreement between labor and management, an agreement that had been made with the government, not to demand raises, not to strike, not to engage in any effort that would undermine America's ability to prosecute the war. That agreement ended in 1919. And labor now looked at its own socioeconomic status. It looked at the cost of living. Between the time America entered the war in 1917 and 1919. They discovered that the cost of living had risen dramatically, while they were held by this agreement to a set wage and a set of circumstances with their employers. They also were concerned that between 1917 and 1919, that the rate of inflation had increased 105%, which meant that while the rate of inflation increased 105%, their wages had not increased at all because of the agreement with employers and the government during the war. They now desperately felt they needed to renegotiate agreements. They needed some parity. Employers were not in the mood to accommodate labor in the post-war period. And what you will have during 1919 is a series of strikes all across the country that will pop up. The Seattle shipyard strike in 1919. the steel strike of 1990. A host of other strikes, and strikes that were even, shall we say, strikes that people would not have expected. There was a policeman strike in Boston which was unprecedented. Policemen did not go on strike. But in this particular instance in 1919, and this was obviously, this had to be the work of what? Of Bolsheviks, Reds. That the police, who were never paid really an adequate salary, saw their income ravaged by inflation. They will ask the city of Boston for an increase in their wages. They will refuse. A certain rump group will go on strike. And in the end, because of the attitude of the city, other policemen will go out and strike in sympathy. But the newspapers had a field day with this. One governor, the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, will catapult to prominence as he responds to the Boston police strike. He will make the comment that there is no reason, there's no justification to strike against the public welfare at any time or under any circumstances. The policeman strike, like the other strikes that will pop up in America, will be broken essentially because they will be accused of being influenced by this conspiracy by Bolsheviks and the communists. Then you had some politicians who always like to make hay of things. James Burns of South Carolina gave a speech in which he said that he knew that the Bolsheviks were coming because he had proof in South Carolina. He had proof that the Bolsheviks and the blacks, who had always chafed under Southern oppression, was now going to join together and they were going to revolt in the South. And Burns said that what we should do is round up all the blacks and the reds and send them to Guam and turn it into a penal colony. But for a while, most Americans, and particularly the most important one, the Attorney General of the United States, did not take this notion of a conspiracy seriously. This person was A. Mitchell Palmer. A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer is really a fascinating individual. In 1912, Palmer was the floor manager for Woodrow Wilson. Wilson liked A. Mitchell Palmer, who was a Quaker by religion. In fact, Wilson offered A. Mitchell Palmer the cabinet post of Secretary of War. And Palmer turned it down in 1912. Palmer said that, President Wilson, you want a man of war, and as a Quaker, I am a man of peace. And while he turned down the Secretary of War position, later on he would accept the position of Attorney General. Yes.
What do you mean by floor manager?
He orchestrated, he got delegates together, he negotiated for votes and for delegates and things like that for Wilson. It's an important, he ran, in a sense, he ran the organization on the floor, made sure that there was lines of communication between delegates, things like that. Palmer did not take the Red Scare seriously for a while. In fact, one of his minor officials in the Attorney General's office came to him and asked A. Mitchell Palmer, was he not concerned about the rumors and the strikes and the fear that the Bolsheviks were coming, that there was a conspiracy? Should he not begin to take some action? And offered his services to A. Mitchell Palmer, this minor official, who becomes, this minor official just happens to be named J. Edgar Hoover. A young J. Edgar Hoover at this time, but still a little bulldog. Well, Palmer tells him eventually, he tells him no. I mean, he says, I'm not really concerned about that. I mean, I don't think I think it's exaggerated. I think this whole thing is blown out of proportion. Well, several things will happen that will change A. Mitchell Palmer. One will be the sending of a series of letter bombs to Americans of all political and ideological persuasions. In other words, it wasn't simply Democrats who got them or Republicans. Letter bombs were sent to Americans in spite of their philosophy or their political ideology. These letter bombs came in brown, inconspicuous brown letters. I mean, they were actually, they seemed to be advertisements. Let me give you an example of one. The petite black maid, Lucy, of Senator Thomas Hardwick of Georgia, went out to retrieve the mail from the mailbox. Lucy came back and she had a stack of mail in her hand, and Mrs. Hardwick looked through, the wife of Thomas Hardwick, she sifted through the mail and she said, well, a lot of this is just junk mail. Here, Lucy, you open the junk mail. And one letter that had up in the left-hand corner, Gimbel's department store. And Gimbel's was a famous large department store, and she assumed that it was some advertisement. So as Lucy took the letter opener to open this inconspicuous brown letter from Gimbel's, a blinding explosion occurred and blew off both of Lucy's hands. 16 letter bombs were sent to famous Americans around the country. Some ended up in the dead letter box because they couldn't get the right address. And so the post office went on high alert as every brown letter became suspicious. I remember a few years ago, a professor at the University of Michigan received a brown letter envelope. And in fact, it was a letter bomb and exploded. Some disgruntled person we thought at the time, now we know better, some disgruntled person, we thought it was some disgruntled students. So for a while, we were very careful about opening our mail. I just gave mine to the secretaries and let them open it. I figured they were specially trained. I wasn't. They could. I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that. But I was leery of anything that I couldn't see through. As I put it up to the light, if I couldn't see anything through it, and that could have set it off for the heat. You know, not being a person of any military background, you know, I was a sitting target for anything. So, thank goodness, most of my students seem to have a fondness for me. Well, back to Mitchell Palmer and how he was affected. One night, and Palmer still, even after the letter bombs, Palmer still did not panic about these rumors of the Red Scare. One evening, Palmer and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were returning from a social affair in the nation's capital. They lived across the street from one another. As Palmer drove FDR home, FDR invited A. Mitchell Palmer in for a nightcap. And Palmer said he had some work to do. He had to work in the study, so he would have to pass. And so he went down and turned back around and went to his home. As he walked through the foyer and into the library and the study, and just as he sat down and got comfortable, there was a huge explosion. Blew off the entire front of his house. Well, Palmer was unharmed, shaken, but unharmed. The investigation revealed that it had been the work of an Italian anarchist. How do we know it was the work of an Italian anarchist? Well, this anarchist, on his way to place the bomb neatly at the door and then scurry away, stumbled over the steps. And he was blown up with the bomb. So, as the detectives say, they could piece together what had happened. And they found his identification, and they found copies of a anarchist newspaper called, entitled The Call. After this, Palmer begins to change. He no longer simply dismisses this as simply exaggerated. Everything now has a new significance. The strikes that are taking place, the letter bombs, the communist activities, particularly by the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, called the Wobblies, a radical group, which had been virtually decimated even during the war itself. Suddenly, he gives J. Edgar Hoover the power to develop a file on suspected Bolsheviks and communists. Hoover will jump into his work aggressively and enthusiastically, and in the end, Hoover will be able to compile a file of more than 500,000 Americans who may be suspicious of being a Bolshevik or a communist. The one thing about J. Edgar Hoover, he always did things in a big way. But Palmer became even more obsessed suddenly with this Bolshevik revolution that was supposed to be targeting America. So far, there was nothing really to connect. That was a connected conspiracy. These seemed to be individual, random events. But Palmer, speaking before a ladies' group, said that God had spoken to him. And that God had told him that indeed this was the work of the Bolshevik, and they were trying to undermine America, and it was his duty and his obligation to round up every godless Bolshevik and put them on an ark, like Noah on an ark, and send them back to that godless country they came from, Russia. Mitchell will change dramatically. He will establish a fleet of trains. These trains will be sealed trains. The trains will pick up suspected Bolsheviks from Centralia, Washington, all the way to Ellis Island, and they will be packed on these trains, which will be sealed. And on the top of the train, you will see in red letters from the air an R. This R stands for what? For Reds. It's hard to believe that Palmer had lost it. Palmer then will conduct, beginning in November, the so-called Palmer raids of 1919, which will be raids that will simply send teams of federal officers arresting people, often simply because they had their last names were Russian or Southern and Eastern Europeans. Without due process, many were deported, and in fact, a whole group were rounded up and sent to Ellis Island, where many of the men were separated from their crying children and families, and they were put aboard a ship called the Beaufort. That was the Ark, a ship called the Beaufort, and sent on its way to Russia. In every city, in Detroit, people of Polish background were arrested and taken down to the federal building and kept naked on the cold floor down in the Justice Building. Soon, by the end of the year, there were people who became concerned because still, as yet, with all the arrests and the deportations and the kangaroo trials and the violation of civil rights, there still had not been revealed a concerted evidence of a concerted plot, a red revolutionary plan. Some began to wonder if, in fact, God had spoken to A. Mitchell Palmer, or perhaps someone from the Democratic Presidential Nominating Committee. In other words, They were wondering whether or not Palmer was simply doing this to put himself in a position to win the presidential nomination of 1920, which he will run for. But it really will be an official in the Department of the Interior who will simply say enough is enough. It will be Louis Post, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior, who will now cancel A. Mitchell Palmer's deportations. Soon, the country believes that Palmer has been too excessive. They will recapture their senses, and the Red Scare will simply sort of peter out by the middle of the 1920. The last tragic, I guess, effect of the Red Scare was the execution of two Italians who were known, self-proclaimed, unabashed anarchists by the name of Nikolai Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti. These two were arrested for the murder of two individuals, one of whom was the paymaster of a company in Braintree, Massachusetts. The problem with this was not that they were guilty, but the trial that they received. It was a trial that concentrated almost virtually nothing on the case itself. In fact, you have the judge referring to the two defendants as those anarchist bastards. It's kind of hard to get a fair trial when the judge refers to you as that. Felix Frankfurter, the famous lawyer who became a Supreme Court justice, wrote in protest of what he called a travesty of justice in terms of the kind of trial that they received. Less to do with their participation in what had taken place than the fact that they were radicals and anarchists. Eventually, they would be executed. With their execution would come the end of this chapter called the Red Scare. Later we'll talk about another within, like as in any good novel, there are subplots, and there are subplots we're going to look at called the Red Summer that will take place too within 1919. But we'll look at that when we look at, we're going to look at African Americans in the 20s, women and Hispanics in the 20s in America, but we'll look at that a little bit later. But in terms of the Red Scare, the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti will officially end the Red Scare, although there will be obviously hard feelings will linger for a long time. And it really is one of the one of the most shameful aspects of American history, whom Americans are not proud to remember. The only other that will perhaps compare with this will be the McCarthy era that we'll talk about a bit later. Yes?
Were they guilty of killing? Was there proof that they were guilty of killing them?
There is some evidence that they may have been involved in the robbery, but the evidence was never really brought out. I mean, you know, the evidence was all tainted by such bias. So it's hard to know. Some scholars have argued there was sufficient evidence that perhaps had they gotten a proper trial, they would have been found guilty anyway. What upsets scholars is less, I think, the innocence or guilt, but the process, the due process, and the notion that people are innocent until proven guilty, and the attitude of the judge, which totally violated their rights within the court. It was that, I think, more than anything. There is a strong possibility that they indeed were involved and committed the crime. Certainly, that's what some argue. But when you get in a trial that is full of emotion, full of heat and fire, and not reason, you taint the trial, you taint the process, you taint the country, and that's what Frankfurter was afraid and was concerned about. Well, this has been a tough period for the U.S. The war, the Red Scare, they had made great sacrifices to make the world safe for democracy. They had been disappointed. Wilson had led them into a war to make the world safe for democracy, and it was clear that Americans in 1920, as we moved toward the presidential election in 1920, Americans were simply tired. They were tired of altruism. They were tired of nostrums. They were tired of self-sacrifice. They wanted to get back to what historians called normalcy. They wanted to get back to normalcy. They wanted things to be the way they used to be before the war, to take care of Americans first. You see this both domestically, and you will see this in terms of foreign policy. Americans will become isolationists in the post-World War I period. Part of it because of the things that transpired. To show you how desperate the Americans were for some, simply for a president who would not demand too much of them. A president who understood what the American people wanted. You would have the election of a Republican. A Democrat did not have a chance in the 1920 election, as the Americans would choose, well, the Republican Party actually would choose, and really, and this is important to show you, they sensed that the American people did not want a controversial Republican candidate. So they chose someone who virtually was unknown. They chose a senator from Ohio, Warren G. Harding. And Warren G. Harding, by every historian's account, was no world beater. Even his closest advisors often quipped that the only thing that was presidential about Warren G. Harding was that he looked like a president. Another critic said that, my God, when Warren G. Harding gave speeches, they were speeches full of pompous phrases, moving across the landscape in search of an idea. And if by chance he came upon an idea, he would grab it and make it a prisoner until it died of overwork and death. It's not what's exactly the nicest thing to say about Warren G. Harding, but even his father. His father had this to say about Warren G. Harding. He said, thank God that he was not born a girl. Because if he had, he would have been in the family way all the time because he could not say no. In fact, that was, if we look at tragic flaws in presidents, it was perhaps Warren Harding's tragic flaw in a Shakespearean way that he really had a difficult time saying no to his friends and even to females. I mean, we talk about the presidency of William Clinton. Well, Warren G. Harding actually does Clinton one better. During his presidency, Warren G. Harding was actually caught in the closet with a White House closet, one of those big closets, with one of his secretaries. And I shall leave it there. But let me tell you that Henry Ford's wife was so outraged at what she found out, what he was doing in that closet, that she asked her husband to run for president because he has so disgraced the White House. As his running mate, but this was all before he became president, as his running mate, you had a man of just a real contrast. You had Calvin Coolidge from Vermont. We talked about he was born in Vermont. He was the product of 5 generations of farmers. As we will see, that will be incredibly important for the Americans, for America, when Harding will die of a stroke in a moment. We'll get rid of Harding. You know, he will, in fact, come to personify everything that Americans needed in the post-World War period. But let's talk only a moment, about Warren G. Harding. I've described him, and in a sense, I think Harding was simply too close, too nice. His administration would come to be marred by the scandals of what became known as the Ohio Gang. A group who met at a house on 8th Street in Washington, D.C., and there they had fun, they played poker, they stayed up all times of the night. But they were men who took advantage of Harding. Harding himself, there's nothing in the record to suggest that Harding himself ever participated in or knowingly knew of the scandals that would eventually leak out both during his administration and particularly after he died. But by 1922, there were rumors. There were rumors that many, including his cabinet members, were involved with corruption. It became so bad for Harding that in June of 1923, Harding would take a trip to California, to San Francisco, where he suffered a blood clot, an embolism, and died. But even before he died, he suspected that investigations were being conducted by the Senate. And he once remarked to his friends, to his close friends, he said, "My God, He says, I can take care of my enemies. I know how to deal with my enemies. It's my friends. It's my GD friends. This is a family show. That keep me walking the floor of the White House night after night. See, even presidents cursed. I should have said expletive deleted. It was his friends that kept him. He could deal with his enemies, but his friends were the ones that were killing him. And in the end, yes, the scandals continue to leak in their investigations, and indeed, where there are rumors, there's absolutely truth to the fact that there were scandals during the Harding administration. The most notable, we could go, you could look at almost in every, Colonel Forbes, who was in charge of the Veterans Bureau. Charles Forbes, in charge of the Veterans Bureau. His name is not on there because it's not very important. I just want to talk about what he did. He condemned millions of dollars of perfectly good medical supplies, bandages, medicines, all sorts of things for veterans, condemned shiploads of them as unusable, and then resold them for a fraction of their worth. He gave contracts for the building of Veterans Bureau facilities to people who gave him kickbacks. What a way to treat our veterans. And then you had Albert Fall. Albert Fall was a cabinet member, no less. Secretary of the Interior. Albert Fall was accused of taking Navy oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, become known as the Teapot Dome scandal, took naval oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, took them out of circulation and gave them to Harry Sinclair of the Mammoth Oil Company to allow them to develop the area for a kickback. Remove the oil reserves from the Navy, leased them to Harry Sinclair and the Sinclair syndicate of the Mammoth Oil Company for kickback. If that was not bad enough, what about his Attorney General, Harry Daugherty? Now you could probably, here was an old wily politician from Ohio. And he was, you could almost suspect him anyway because of the way he even talked about the 1920 election. He is the one that really invents the notion of the smoke-filled rooms that we always talk about. And this is how he talked about the smoke-filled rooms. This term came into use, actually, to describe machine politics after the Republican convention that nominated Harding. This is what Daugherty had to say, told the press about the election. He said the convention will be deadlocked and the other candidates have gone their limit. Some 12 or 15 men, worn out and bleary-eyed for lack of sleep, will sit down about 2 o'clock in the morning around the table in a smoke-filled room in some hotel and decide the nomination. When that time comes, Harding will be selected. That is how the term smoke-filled rooms and how politics are done. It was a statement taken by now the Attorney General, Harry M. Daugherty. Now, what did he do? He was accused of selling priceless German patents confiscated during the war that was being kept really in the customs house. He was accused of selling priceless German patents to private developers for a kickback. Totally illegal, had absolutely no business doing it. Harry Daugherty, the Attorney General under Harding. Now, what happens to Albert Fall first, who sold the naval oil reserves to Harry Sinclair? He is the first cabinet member in American history to be convicted and sent to jail. He received a year in prison and a fine. But historians have argued that a year in prison and a fine for all the money that he made and he had when he came out was nothing. What about Harry Daugherty? What about, how did he, was he convicted? No. You know why? Because he made the following comment that he was not going to comment on it because if he did not want to in any way sully or soil the name of the late President Warren G. Harding. Well, Harding can't defend himself because Harding has gone to the great White House in the sky. He's dead. He can't defend himself. So he is implying that if he testifies, somehow he is going to implicate the President of the United States in this activity. And he did not want to hurt his widow, who was already hurt because of Harding's inability to control himself. But it would have hurt her more. But by bluffing that way, by insinuating we're going to drag the good name of the President of the United States into this, the Senate dropped the investigation of Daugherty and he got out of it. What about the American people, though? What is fascinating? This is the first real scandal in which a president and his cabinet members, and I've only named a few of them, there were more scandals than this. How did the American people respond? Were they grateful to the Senate who conducted these investigations to bring out corruption? Corruption at the highest offices in the presidency? The answer is no. The American people were absolutely livid at the Senate for subjecting them to these trials in these investigations. Why would the American people feel such a way? One was because they were simply tired. They were tired of the events that had been taking place since when? Since World War I. The Red Scare, and now they have to be subjected to these scandals. They were simply did not want to what? To hear anything else. That's one. They were tired. They had gone through a period in which they were just sick of it. So they called the senators mudslingers. They convicted for all. So, I mean, these were based in fact. It was just their feeling. And they did not relish the idea of tarnishing the reputation of a president of the United States. At this time, Americans were far more concerned about the image of the presidency and what it stood for in America. And they simply did not and would not cavalierly in any way jeopardize that reputation, even though clearly there were wrongs. Well, Harding dies, and he is succeeded by a perfect person for the country at the time. Calvin Coolidge, who had been his vice president, becomes the president and will run for election in 1924 and will be elected. Easily. In fact, I want to, when Harding was elected in 1920, some newspaper person commented when he beat Cox, the Democratic candidate in FDR, that this wasn't an election. This was assault and battery. That the Democrats had gotten beaten so bad that if this were a fight, the police would have had to been called in to stop it, to stop this brutal beating of this person. Well, Coolidge virtually beats his candidate almost in the same way because he personifies what Americans want. He is the epitome of all the American virtues. He is of old Vermont stock in terms of he comes from 5 generations of farmers. Farmers have always what? Held a very pristine image in the American mind. Hard-working people. People that personify the American rugged individualism, American basic core values. The only thing that Coolidge didn't lack was a personality. I mean, Coolidge, one person referred to was, I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt referred to Coolidge. He looked as if he had been weaned on a pickle. He was taciturn in terms of his personality. But he knew what the country wanted, he believed, in 1924. They wanted a country that would allow business to thrive, business to grow. He believed with the appointment of Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury that Americans were interested in what was now taking place in America, and this was a second revolution, this time a technological revolution. Just as profound as the railroads, we would have the revolution in transportation with the car, the automobile. Business would once again come to dominate American society. When we meet next time, we will look at the 1920s as a paradoxical decade because it has so many interesting and conflicting tendencies. I'll see you then.